Hey guys, before we get into the interview with Sophie and Birdsong, incredible interview by the way, we want to quickly shout out Endless West. They are based out of San Francisco. They make this Glyph whiskey in addition to a bunch of other products. Don't ask me exactly how they do it because I'm not a science guy, but essentially they break down the whiskey to its molecular components and produce it from the ground up, which results in a much more sustainable process, much more ethical process, and we're super pumped to have them on board. So shout out Endless West. Thank you all for coming on board, and now let's get to the interview. All right, so we now welcome on a very special guest. Her name is Sophie, and she is one of the founding members of Birdsong. Birdsong is a super inspiring clothing company based out of London. They do an amazing job promoting ethics and sustainability in fashion, specifically women's fashion. And yeah, Sophie, we're super excited to have you on. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you.
Of course. So we want to jump right in. Give our viewers a little bit of an idea of who you are, what your background is, where you're from, and how you got into ethics and sustainability in the fashion industry, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So it was a little bit of a roundabout journey. I grew up in a little seaside town in the northeast of England, which was about as far as you can get away from London.
Okay.
And when I was 15, I was scouted to be a model and got a contract with quite a big agency. So I was kind of coming down on the train and learning about the fashion industry, which was super kind of exotic and exciting considering I lived in a little seaside town. Got to know all sorts about different kind of industry magazines, how shoots work, the fashion industry, and kind of fell in love with the creative aspect. Um, but also experienced a lot of things that were quite I don't know, sat quite uneasily with me around like body policing and how homogenous looking most models were, being told to stay as I was when I had kind of like a child's body. Um, and I'm a white, cis, able-bodied woman who was very, very slim at the time. So realizing a little bit later down the line when I was a little bit older and more self-aware, more socially kind of conscious, that the modeling agency was even less representative than I'd first kind of realized,
Mm-hmm.
and all those problems with it. Um, I kind of worked in retail for a long time. I should say I was a very unsuccessful model as a teenager. I was very clumsy, very like goofy looking. Yeah, I didn't really get a whole amount of work to be honest, but probably for the better.
I think it's harder than
Um,
most people think. The whole modeling
hmm,
path. It seems like it's tough.
yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that I had like a no nonsense feminist northern mother who was like, "No, you're not getting on a train. No, you're not missing school. They'll treat you like a piece of meat. Like,
Right.
why do they want you?"
Right.
um, she kind of protected me from the more evil side of the industry. But yeah, I guess like I always wanted to work in the kind of social sector. So the main thing about Birdsong is that it's a social enterprise. So as much as profit matters to keep us going, people and planet are the most important aspects of the business. And I think that's from growing up, like having parents that were really active in the local community. My mum taught people with learning disabilities, arts and crafts when I was growing up. And now we work with adults with learning disabilities who pack and post all of our items. Um, she's also done stuff with kind of women's groups. And I got really involved in kind of activism when I was a teenager. I worked at, I volunteered for like a rape crisis center in my early 20s, worked with a bunch of women's organizations when I moved down to London, and realized that a lot of women's organizations and a lot of grassroots charities that support local communities in London and throughout the UK have had horrendous funding cuts since the Conservative government have been in for the past 11, nearly 12 years. So, based on that, fashion was like the conduit that gave me most joy and it was I found most exciting and expressive and creative. but also translated to being able to support these grassroots groups who make beautiful things and have
Right.
fantastic crafting skills, but are very alienated from that industry.
Right. No, that's fascinating. And I think it's super cool to hear the backgrounds of we've talked to a couple other super inspiring founders, and it's very interesting to hear that you guys come from relatively similar backgrounds when it comes to sort of the values that your parents preach. I was reading a piece on you, or an interview that you had done, I think with Vogue, where you were talking about you were 17 years old walking down the street thinking of all of the horrendous things that were happening in the fashion industry. And I just kept thinking to myself, when I was 17, I was thinking about like, how can I get 30 minutes on my curfew? Like how could I extend my Saturdays? And you were thinking about, changing the world. So do you think that idea really stemmed from sort of your parents and your upbringing? Or do you think that that's sort of just something that you have innately inside of you that would have come out no matter what?
It's really interesting. I think they've always instilled like a social conscience on me because, again, they both kind of worked in the civil service, which is like the
Mm-hmm.
public sector. Um, but yeah, it's interesting. I've always had like eco anxiety. I remember even when I was a little kid, I think just picking up on I am a very anxious person, so I think like anyone who's anxious, your brain's kind of doing like a sky scanner for anything that can go wrong at any time. And
Right.
it definitely plugged into when I was a kid, worrying about like the ozone, worrying about the ice caps, just doing like a mental map of everything that could possibly go wrong,
Right.
which is, horrible to live with when you're a kid. But I remember, my dad's like a typical boomer. The way they live their lives is not particularly sustainable at all.
Same,
Obviously
same with,
living in like
same on my end.
okay, good to know. So like, when I go around, I'm like, oh, I can't believe you have two cars and you've flown four times this year. Like, it's really stressing me out. Having said that, my dad did work in sustainability for Newcastle City Council, where I grew up. When I was a teenager for a couple of years before he got made redundant, and he basically brought home Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth to
Okay.
watch when he was preparing for that job role. And I think I was maybe 14 or 15, and I watched it and I couldn't sleep for 2 weeks, and it kind of changed my life. Like,
It had that big of an impact on you.
yeah, a huge impact. I think because I'd always kind of worried about that stuff. And
Mhm.
then, um, yeah, I mean, learning about the fashion industry, I think I'd always kind of been interested in workers' rights and labor, and I was still quite naive about it, but I started working in a vintage shop with a friend's older sister when I was like 17, and that's kind of where I thought more about the environmental impact of clothing.
Okay.
And then I was a shop assistant at American Apparel, which are obviously infamous
Right.
company, not particularly known for being feminist or treating their employees very well, but they did produce clothing for decent wages, and they did a lot of education actually internally to staff around sweatshop labor and the fashion
Okay.
industry. So I learned a huge amount from that and thought, well, this brand are doing lots right, but they're also doing loads wrong in terms of marketing to women and how they
Uh-huh.
treat their women staff. So Birdsong really came about from those experiences, absolutely.
Interesting. Yeah. And those bigger companies, I think it's fascinating because they're so big and have been around so long that they're like, you're right. There is a ton that they're doing correct, but there are these things that are so ingrained in the way they operate that are still wrong and still sort of the past, that it's nice to see things changing. But I think what's really happening is it's spurred by the newer, smaller companies like Birdsong to sort of kick them in the ass and say, "Hey, let's get moving in the right direction." And I think it's happening. It's slow, but I think it is happening. And you touched on something when you brought up your dad that we're kind of struggling with right now as we start, and that's sort of making it accessible, which is exactly why we're doing this sort of sit down, just candid conversations. Because when you say environmentalism and you say social responsibility, there are these massive terms that aren't crazy accessible to a lot of people. And so, like you mentioned, the Al Gore program that you were watching, that kind of made it accessible to you. Seeing your parents work in social services, that made it accessible to you. In your vintage shop experience. So, in the creation of Birdsong and sort of throughout your career, how have you been able to make your brand and your values resonate with people that don't have those like direct touch points with the issues you're dealing with?
That's really interesting. I think like you've kind of got to meet people where they're at for a certain
Uh-huh.
like at a certain extent. Especially when we're a tiny brand, we've not got a whole lot of reach. We're a brand of two people. Most of our reach is organic or through press and social media, but it's really interesting when we first started. We'd be writing press releases and talking loads about how we paid London living wage, how we were sustainable, we were small batch, and all anyone wanted to write about was the fact that our models had hairy armpits and stretch marks. That's
Really?
all I wanted to talk about. And it's because feminism was like a huge topic.
A hot topic kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
Back in
clicks.
2016. Exactly, and that kind of fed into that narrative of what was popular at the time. So that really helped because obviously we already had those values. And then a few years later, sustainability became a really big thing, and suddenly everyone wants to talk about how sustainable we are. Suddenly, we're not at the kids' table anymore of like, oh, you work
Uh-huh.
for charity, nice, pat on the head. It was like, actually, you know what you're talking about. Like, this is something you've cared about for a while. And I think, especially with the COVID-19 crisis and, the UK high street, I don't know, like massive names like Topshop going into administration, um, and garment workers not being compensated for orders. If you've not heard about this, then look at the Pay Up campaign. Loads of like
Hmm.
British fashion brands who manufacture in places like Cambodia, Bangladesh, have basically refused to pay for millions of garments that have already been made because they can't sell them because the UK has been in lockdown.
Right.
And that's really drawn attention to ethics, and consumers are finally kind of engaging with us on the living wage issue because it was also exposed that some brands still do make in the UK, but they're paying £3.50 an hour, which is a third of the living wage, and it's half of what minimum wage should be. So it's illegal, um, and not enough to live off, poverty wages. So I think the ways that we've engaged our audience in all these issues have been to kind of paint a positive, because there are amazing campaign organizations that talk about how dark the fashion industry is, and
Hmm.
we want to offer like a joyful alternative. So we kind of do that. We've done podcasts, we've done blogs, but the things that people really connect to are kind of our use of memes,
Of
to talk
course.
about the fashion industry. And also, I think a real trend that we've seen, that's galvanized kind of activists and made things so much more accessible, especially around kind of Black Lives Matter, has been the really clever use of infographics on social media as
Okay.
well. So I think we're still learning how to communicate in a way that's accessible and non-alienating, but I do think that social media is evolving in a way that is actually really powerful for disseminating that kind of information, as we saw by like all the amazing informative posts and a lot of kind of like less amazing, less informative posts, and like the black squares posted by lots of white people perhaps that weren't as informative. But yeah, I think that I find the use of social media as a means to disseminate those ideas really exciting, and that's what keeps us going, I think.
So it all comes back to memes. Who would have thunk it? That's super interesting, and I think that the use of infographics is one that has sort of always interested me because there's a fine line between a really informative, really useful one that connects with a lot of people and one that's just overwhelming and you can't read. And figuring that out, I think, is a problem that a lot of brands are dealing with as they try to convey their values and why things are important to their consumers. And it's been interesting to see companies figure out how to do that in a concise and clean way. I think you guys do a really nice job, by the way, on Instagram and the other platforms I've started following you on. Very related to what you were just talking about is the idea of greenwashing. You can see it in. We actually spoke to a financial advisor and his company. It's an asset management company, and he was saying that it happens with asset management companies. It happens everywhere, but I think the most clear example is in the fashion industry. Greenwashing. For those of you that don't know what exactly greenwashing is, it's sort of selling that you're doing the right things for the wrong reasons. You're saying, hey, we're being sustainable not for the purpose of being sustainable, but for the purpose of selling a T-shirt. How do you convey to your consumers that you're not greenwashing, that you actually are doing the right things?
Mm, yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, our entire setup is different because, as I said, we're a social enterprise. Like, we
Mm-hmm.
have legal conditions written into our company paperwork that says we have to have a certain amount of profit that goes back to community projects, and we have to be as sustainable and socially conscious as possible. Whereas every other for-profit like fashion brand, profit is the only
Right.
answer. Profit is the
Right.
only goal. Um, and they'll want to look more sustainable or socially conscious if they think that's going to help them get to that profitable goal, but they're not living wage employers. Um, I guess like we're doing things like we want to qualify to be a B corporation, so we're in the process of like applying for that. I think it's a bit more popular in the States than it is in the UK.
Yeah, definitely is.
But we have the living wage mark here in the UK, which, as far as I know, no high street brand has for their
Really.
garment workers. Yeah, absolutely not. Like, I don't think any mainstream fashion brand pays a living wage for their garment workers. So,
That's crazy.
yeah, and then I guess like it's really hard because brands are becoming increasingly sophisticated at pretending they're ethical. Like, if you search ethical in Google, a high street brand that has no duty of care towards their garment workers at all will come up on like the second or third page
Mm-hmm.
because they can afford to buy those keywords up. But there are laws actually in Europe and in the UK coming into place, that will restrict environmental and social claims that companies can make. So that's really good because we can back up our claims absolutely.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we are quite well trusted because the sheer volume of clothing that we're making as well, like, is such a tiny fraction of what, high street brands are making. Everything's made to order. Um, when you buy an item, you get a picture and a signature of the woman who made it
That's
and a little
cool.
bit about her. And we've got kind of behind the scenes videos of our production manager slash designer, who's my business partner, like hanging out with all the women that we work with, and we know them. We know every single woman by name. They're all in London, um, and yeah, we've been to their sons' weddings. I've been to their houses for tea. Like, we know them. We are concerned with their welfare and they're an equal part in this business. So, um, yeah.
That's so cool. And we're working on developing athletic clothing right now. And it's been an absolute shit show to like try to figure out how do we actually do this, because Hannah and I don't have a background in clothing. So we're learning the industry while also trying to figure out, all right, we want to be as transparent as possible. So how do we trace these things back to where they're actually being created? When you started Birdsong, did you have like a great understanding of the whole supply chain already? Or was that something that you were learning as you were developing the company as well?
I think we're quite lucky in a way because we were so naive that we just did everything our own way. Um, I was like 23 when we started.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, I think, well, as I said, because my background was working with women's organizations, we already had connections to
Right.
seamstressing groups. We actually started off the company, we started off doing knitwear because my other business partner, she was um, working at an older person's day center, and they were knitting things and couldn't really get rid of the knitting fast enough. Like, they were knitting for their relatives, they were knitting just to give it to charity shops, they were knitting for different charities, and they'd run out of projects to do basically. And at the same time, were worrying about revenue for their center and
Mm-hmm.
funding cuts and things. So the whole idea of Birdsong came about by approaching charities like that, or ones we'd already worked with, and saying, what is it you need to sell your product easily? um, and then after a couple of years, we kind of stepped in with all the design and the sourcing so that we could get better fabrics and make it more sustainable that way as well. But yeah, we've worked with most of our supply chain for 5-6 years now. We know them
That's
really
nice.
well. And we haven't scaled up massively. We work with one group who's screen print, but unfortunately due to COVID, we've not been able to work with them because we haven't found a suitable premises.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of women who make shoes from home, a community sewing workshop, a local woman who does embroidery on a local housing estate, our two groups of knitters who are knitting from home in the pandemic, and we buy some jewelry and some t-shirts from cooperative slash living wage factories in India so that we can embroider onto the t-shirts. We sell the jewelry straight from them.
Oh, that's cool.
We work with our charity who do all our packaging and postage. So we work with about 10 different groups, and that's as much as we can handle at the moment, to be honest.
Right.
But yeah, I think like we really focus on quality and their social mission rather than kind of how much they can output and what price. That's
Right.
like much lower down the
Yeah.
priority list, which is completely the opposite to how a normal fashion brand operates, obviously.
Going back to a point that I made earlier is the people, we have an incredible support network, Hannah and I do, in our lives, but that they have pushed back a little bit on this idea and said it just doesn't make sense. Like from a cost perspective, you all can't do this because there's a reason that Nike's not doing this. There's a reason that these other companies that might have the resources that can afford to take a couple losses for a while aren't doing this. It's because it's not possible. I'm sure you guys faced similar pushback from people that you knew, people in your lives, when you sort of proposed this new way of doing fashion. What struggles did you guys run into, and how did you sort of silence those critics when you did hear that maybe negative talk?
That's a really good question. I think, when we were trying to get funding, especially, that was really hard because we were told it wasn't scalable,
Mm-hmm.
that, it wasn't the right way to do things. I think for me, I don't want to run my own company unless it's in line with my values. And it's really interesting what someone tells you is kind of stupid and a bad idea 6 years ago. They're now calling us like thought leaders and, changing the face of the fashion industry and all this other stuff, which for me, it just makes common sense. Like,
Yeah.
I don't want to run a company. I wouldn't be able to sleep at night knowing that there's people being exploited for their labor. Like, I think it just kind of feeds into this whole white supremacist idea we have that it's okay for people in the global south to be literally sometimes, slave picking cotton or like um making stuff in indentured labor in order for us in the West to have cheap consumer goods. It doesn't make any sense. And I think especially with the political turmoil that we've seen in the past few years in the whole world's becoming more socially conscious and aware, um we just can't do business as normal. We can't operate like that. I think then the more you dig into supply chains and the more you dig into brands and how they make their money, um, unless they state otherwise, that's kind of the crux of why they're making so much money. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I heard recently, like, there's always someone's paying the cost somewhere. If you have a $15 t-shirt, the cost is probably the laborers aren't getting paid enough. If you have a $500 t-shirt, guess what? You're paying the cost. But yeah, no, that is interesting because especially as we start up, that's something that we've heard repeatedly, and it does. There is some truth to like scalability is hard, but I do think that things are moving in the right direction. And I feel like, do you feel like you all started at one of the perfect times where these ideas were really starting to come into the mainstream? Like, do you think that you could have that your concept would work in the 80s?
That's really interesting. I think, like, to be honest, fast fashion as we know it, I think it's easy for us to forget, especially as kind of millennials or Gen Zers. Fast fashion as we know it has only actually been around for about 20 years. So, especially, I don't know, it was like in the States, but in the UK, 90% of clothing was produced in the UK until the 90s.
Really?
And not saying it's particularly well paid, but I think, it's at least kind of perhaps a little bit harder to ignore and completely because so many fashion brands have supply chains that are so complicated and so dense.
Right.
They will subcontract other workers or play factories off against each other. Whereas at least if you are manufacturing in the same country, you might even own your factory. Even if you're not paying them properly, you will know exactly who's making your clothes.
Uh-huh.
Which makes it harder to kind of exploit people in the same way and on the same scale, I think. So fast fashion as we know it and, environmental collapse. I guess like the environment's been an issue since like the 70s. I think things had to get really bad before people started to see the other way. But, you know, big brands are making more than ever. Like they've not reached peak stuff. Like they're gonna continue to pollute and overproduce well into the future, even though everyone's talking about sustainability now.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and when you're making money hand over fist, I think a lot of people, that's their primary driver. So they're just going to stick to their guns and keep doing business as usual. But like I was saying, I do think things are changing. That might be optimistic and maybe naive of me to say right now. But I mean, the more we look into it, the more brands that we've been impressed with, like you all, that are sort of putting profit, not to the side, but at least on the same level as other things that are important. But do you think that men's fashion isn't doing what they need to do to keep up with women's fashion in terms of ethics and sustainability practices?
It's really interesting because I think as much as production for fast fashion has accelerated, that has mostly been within women's market. So making things that are really, really trend driven and making things with forced obsolescence so that they'll become like come apart after one wash. I feel like you see that more in women's wear.
True.
Um, I think men's clothes. If even if you go to the high street, they tend to be less trend driven.
Mm-hmm.
Even things like socks tend to be thicker. If you buy like men's socks from the high street, they're already
Yeah,
kind of made with a better quality in mind. Um, I mean, I know a lot of really fantastic unisex and men's sustainable brands. I think maybe they don't get as much attention because people still really love the kind of like creative aspect of women's wear, and it's
yeah,
less
that's fair.
in the choices. Um, which is a little bit unfair. I mean, I think anyone should be able to wear anything. um, so yeah, I think it's interesting. I think as well when you look at kind of, I guess it depends on your market and your audience, but I think men are already more used to the thing like the concept of getting like a suit tailored or perhaps having like slightly more streamlined wardrobes anyway, which is inherently more sustainable. So it's interesting. I think actually fast fashion will accelerate and we'll see like more kind of trends being generated to men and being sold to men. And then as that happens, there'll probably even be more um
Right.
low brands kind of catering to menswear as well. But yeah, I definitely know. I think like a lot of the bigger players, kind of like Allbirds or Sheep Inc., Nudie Jeans, they all do beautiful menswear. So
It's true. Yeah, no, that is interesting. And no, you're right. There's only so much you can really do with a t-shirt, which is like 90% of what I personally own. What I feel like, you know, stereotypical man, his wardrobe is just t-shirts. And you're right. As more sort of trends are introduced, I think there's more room for innovation, which does make sense. But it was interesting to me as I started looking into this. I was like, wow, a lot of places really put feminism, ethics, and sustainability sort of in this one bucket and promote good business. And sort of a lot of times not included in that is the menswear. And so it's been interesting to me to sort of see that, which I didn't expect to see when originally looking into this. Um, Now, like I mentioned before, we don't want to take too much of your time. And so one question that we've been asking everyone that we talk to has been, as we've started on this journey and tried to really define for ourselves what ethics and sustainability means to us, we've realized that there are an infinite amount of definitions for both terms. People pick and choose how they say they're ethical. People pick and choose how they say they're sustainable, sometimes turning a blind eye to some things in order to promote others. And so I'm curious, how do you, for yourself, and then also for your company, Birdsong, how do you define ethics and how do you define sustainability? And sort of why did you pick those definitions as opposed to me focusing on other things?
that's really interesting. And I think going back to donut economics, which is if you look it up, it's a really great way of kind of visualizing what you're talking about. Um, I think we've always been based on the fact that ethics to us means that everyone we work with is working in a dignified, happy environment. Even aside from wages, like if someone's stressed and hates working for us, that's not ethical. So we didn't in fact report, and 100% of our makers said that working with us improves their lives, and not just in terms of like how much money they're making, but in terms of like the atmosphere, how they feel, how they're respected on a human level. So for us, it's like, are our working conditions equitable and comparable for people working in kind of like head office roles, like me with the marketing, and our garment makers, is that equitable? And also kind of wages come into it as well, and we're paid a comparable kind of like hourly wage for the work that we do. And then in terms of sustainability, I think it's about it's really difficult because if unless you're kind of using that's everything that's recycled or homegrown, there's no such thing really as a sustainable fabric because it's
Right.
still using resources.
Hmm.
Unless you're making fabric that's 100% compostable and gives back to the earth,
Right.
um, no fabric is 100% sustainable. It still takes resources and energy. But for us, it's about how can we mitigate that impact as much as possible. And things like, this dress that's made from recycled or the green one that's made from tencel, um, using kind of biodegradable buttons and things. Um, yeah, I think sustainability is a massively nebulous term, and
Right.
it's something that myself and my business partner have both committed the past 10, 12 years to learning more about, and we still feel like we're still learning every day. Like it's like a continuous journey. I don't think sustainable is a static definition. It has to move with the science, um, and the more we realize about our impact on Earth. So that's like a really long-winded explanation.
No, I love
Um,
it. I love it. And I think, I mean, those explanations are always what we found is whenever we ask that question, the explanation is super long because it's like there's no like, here's what it is, one line answer. Like you can't do that with ethics and sustainability. And so it's been amazing to hear all these different definitions. And I love what you did, how you incorporated the whole lifestyle of your supply chain into that ethical piece. I think a lot of people, we always want to put a number to something. And so there's my dog. So what they do is they say, hey, our workers are paid enough money, and that's check the ethical box. And I think it's great that you guys incorporate more of a holistic view because I don't think enough people actually do that when saying how they're ethical and actually, walking the ethical walk.
mhm.
And then the sustainability piece, like you're right, like Hannah and I, as part of the reason that we started the company was because we took a look at ourselves and said, we're not sort of living the way that we really want to live moving forward, the way that we want to eventually teach our kids how to live. So let's shift how we do that. And so along that, we've also been learning about sustainability and ethics. And you're right, like sustainability, there's so much stuff out there where you can read, listen to, watch, and so many steps you can take. And so one of the things that we're trying to preach is incrementality and taking steps where you can afford to take them, but just constantly making those steps forward in the right direction as opposed to backwards or just staying stagnant at the status quo. And you guys are doing an incredible job at just taking those steps in from the actual production of your clothing to the way that you shoot your models. You guys are an inspiration to a lot of people that are out there, us included, that are trying to start things that are trying to move in the right direction.
Thank you so much for the kind words. I really hope so. It's a lifelong journey. It's a lifelong process of learning, I think. So
Yeah.
yeah, just
Yeah,
keep
we're figuring that out too. But yeah, so I think, like I said, don't want to take too much of your time, everyone. She is Sophie Slater. She is changing the world with Birdsong. Check them out at birdsong.london. We're based in the US, but check them out across the pond, guys. I'm telling you, they're worth it. Support a good cause.
ship internationally. So
Ship internationally. So check them out. And yeah, Sophie, can't thank you enough for your time. And I hope that whatever food came to you is good.
thank you so much. Thanks for your patience while I was getting my food delivery.
Yeah, don't worry about it. Great talking to you, Sophie, and
Yeah,
have a great night.
you too. Thanks so much.
Sure. See ya.